To show a sheet, there is a built-in function Flutter offers us. That's good to show such a bottom modal sheet, I should say. And since I want to show that sheet both when we click that floating action button and when we click that action in the app bar, I will create a method that opens up that sheet so that we can, well, share that method with both places where we want to trigger it. It will return nothing, that method, and I'll name it start add new transaction. The name might be a bit clunky, but in the end, that is what happens here. It doesn't add a new transaction, it starts the process of adding a new transaction. It starts the process by showing the input area for that new transaction data. So start add new transaction is the method name, and in there you can call show modal bottom sheet. It's a function provided by Flutter. That's why this function is available here. So this function can be called, and show modal bottom sheet now needs at least two arguments. The first is a value for the context, because internally this function will use this strange context object with which we haven't worked to show that modal sheet. So we need to pass a value for context here. The good thing is we get a value for context in here. We get it passed into the build function automatically by Flutter, but of course that's the wrong place. We need it up here. Solution is simple. We accept it as an argument here, and I'll name it CTX to avoid confusion with the names. So I forward my context, which I expect to get as an argument, to show modal bottom sheet for the context argument. And then we also need a builder. Builder now is a function that needs to return the widget that should be inside of that modal bottom sheet. The builder function itself also gives us a context, and I'll name this bctx to really make this clear that this is not the same value as this context. This is the context we pass to this function to pass it to the modal bottom sheet. The modal bottom sheet then starts building that sheet that slides in, and to that builder, it again gives us its own context, so its own package of meta information about that widget which it builds. We never use that context. Well, at least now we start using it here indirectly when we pass it to show modal bottom sheet. We get it here nonetheless in the builder in case that inside of the builder, where we now build the widget that should be part of the modal sheet, in case we needed access to the context object there, and you will later in this module learn why you, for example, need the context. So we get it here in case we need it, even though we don't. Since we don't use it, of course, you could use that underscore thing to indicate, I know that I get it, but I don't care. Inside of the builder function here, you now return something, and that something now is the widget you want to show inside of that modal sheet. And in my case, that of course should be that new transaction. So here I want to show new transaction. For that, I now need to import my own new transaction widget with that relative import part. And new transaction now has one disadvantage. It, of course, needs the add transaction function reference. And we outsourced that into user transactions because up until now, that was the perfect solution. We had new transaction and transaction list in there. We had our transaction list, so our list of objects in there. We had the add new transaction method in there, and all that was hidden away from our main Dart file. And now all of a sudden, because we have to trigger start add new transaction from in here in the main Dart file, because here is where we have the app bar and the floating action button, because we have to trigger that function from in here, we now have to bring new transaction back into that main Dart file. And since that needs the add transaction method, we now actually have to bring all our state logic into this file. So there is no way around it. Let's transform this stateless widget to a stateful widget. At least we can do that automatically with the help of the refactoring tool. If you click on it and then use the refactoring shortcut, you can choose convert to stateful widget here. You automatically get your state object. And now in there, I will basically grab my list of transactions and add new transaction from inside the user transactions widget, add it in the main Dart file, here below title controller and amount controller, which I, by the way, don't need there anymore. And now with the transactions and the add transaction method brought over, we need to import our transaction model to unlock that transaction class. So let's add this import here. And of course, now that means that our user transactions widget unfortunately is redundant. And that is also something you'll have in Flutter development, which is why I'm showing it here. You will sometimes build a solution which you then have to break up at some point because you recognize, okay, for this feature, I need to manage my state somewhere else. Otherwise, I can't pass data around. Later in this course, we'll learn about a more elegant state management solution, which avoids having solutions like this, where we have to lift state up to the common denominator. But for the moment, and for simple apps like this, it is fine, and we also won't have a performance problem if we use our main file for managing the state and for rebuilding everything on every change, therefore. We can get rid of the user transaction file, however. We don't need it anymore. And in main Dart, we hence now, instead of returning our user transactions, return our transaction list widget, pass our user transactions into it. User transactions is now managed here in the main Dart already in our my homepage state class. And the remaining thing we have to do, therefore, is that instead of importing user transactions, that's the widget I just deleted, we import the transaction list Dart file with the transaction list widget. Now with that restructuring, we can pass underscore add new transaction, so a pointer at this method, to new transaction here. And now we have a setup here where we just need to wire up this start add new transaction method, which now should be underscore start add new transaction because it's now part of that private state class, and therefore the convention is to make this a private method as well. Now we just have to use this method here and wire it up to our button in the action bar. So here, instead of doing nothing when we press this, we target start add new transaction. Now keep in mind that this requires the build context because it needs to forward that to show modal bottom sheet. So actually we need to call this as an anonymous function so that in here we can call it manually and forward context, which is this context value here. And now we do the exact same for our floating action button down here. And now with that, if you save that and maybe restart the app because we changed a lot, typically the app needs to be restarted thereafter. If you do that, now if you press the plus up there, you see that this action sheet floats in. The same for the floating action bar at the bottom. And that's a default feature you get. You can also click the background to close it. You can also click the action sheet itself to close it. That should eventually change in the future. Until this changes, you can easily fix that by wrapping your new transaction in show modal bottom sheet with a gesture detector, which is another widget I mentioned earlier on a slide, which takes a child, in this case our new transaction, and where you can register a certain gesture, in this case on tap, and simply do nothing when this gesture occurs. This catches this tapping on the bottom sheet and avoids that the sheet gets closed if you tap on the sheet. It still gets closed if you tap on the background, but not if you tap on the sheet. For this to work, you also need to set a behavior, and you need to set this to hit test behavior.opaque. This is important to catch the event and avoid that a tap here on this gesture detector, which itself is invisible, but which has the size of our new transaction widget, that a tap on that also then still triggers a tap on the underlying modal sheet. With this setting, you catch the tap event and avoid that it's handled by anyone else. And this avoids that the sheet closes when you tap on the sheet itself. Again, to my knowledge, this should change in the future, so maybe when you're viewing this, you don't need to add this detector anymore. Here you see now I avoid that this closes when I tap in here, which is of course what I want. I don't want to close the sheet when I tap in here. I want to close it, however, when I tap on the background. And that is what's happening.